Welcome. Let's discuss how we can graph piecewise functions. Here we have a function which is called f of x, and this function it's made out of three different little functions. The first function is display in our first line. Our second function is display in the second line, and the third function is display in the third line. So if we want to graph f of x, we have to graph one line at a time. Let's concentrate in our first line. Notice that there's a comma separating the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the line. In the left-hand side of the comma, we will write down the function that we're going to consider. And on the right-hand side of the comma, we're going to consider a restriction. So if we want to put all this together, in our first line, we're going to consider the equation y equals -4. But we're only going to take a look at the values of x's that are less than -2. So now the way that we're going to be graphing all this is by first, let's graph the whole equation y equals -4. But we don't want to graph the whole line. We only want to graph a small section of this line, and that section is determined by the restriction. Only those values which are less than or equal than -2. So here we have the location of -2, and if we see where we intersect our line, that's about there. So let's erase everything in this line except those x values which are less than -2. So there we have it. But one thing to notice is that underneath the inequality, we have an equal sign. So therefore, at -2, we need to have a solid circle. So we are done with our first line. Now let's take a look at the second line. So here we have our comma, and here we have the left-hand side of the comma and the right-hand side of the comma. The left-hand side is going to tell us what function we should consider. And the right-hand side is going to tell us what are the x values that we are allowed to use. So let's write that down. Let's just consider the function y equals x minus 2. But let's only take a look at the values of x's that are between -2 and +2. So let's start by graphing the equation y equals x minus 2. So here we have a line that has a y-intercept at -2, and we have a slope of 1. So let's graph that line. But we do not want to graph the whole line. We only want to use those x values that are between -2 and +2, which is from here to here. So let's erase everything that we have on this line except this small interval from -2 to +2. But notice that we do not have an equal sign underneath the inequality. So that implies that at -2 and at +2, we need to have an open circle. At -2, we already have a filled circle from our first line, so nothing to worry about there. But at +2, let's place an open circle. Now let's take a look at the third line. So here we have our comma, and on the left-hand side, it's telling us that we're only going to consider the equation y equals -2x plus 4. And the right-hand side, it's going to tell us the restriction or the values of x's that we will use, which in this case are those x values which are greater or equal than 2. So let's start by graphing the whole line y equals -2x plus 4. That's a line that has a y-intercept at 4, and it has a slope of -2. So now let's graph this line. So now we have the graph of the line -2x plus 4. But we don't want to consider the whole line. We only want to consider those x values which are greater or equal to 2, which is everything that is on the right-hand side of 2. So let's erase the section of this line that is not in this interval of x being greater or equal than 2. But one thing to check is that in the restriction, there was an equal sign underneath the inequality. So we're not going to have an open circle, but we need to fill it up. So we are done. We have successfully graphed the piecewise function, which is made out of these three sections. The section displaying the first line, the section displaying the second line, and the section displayed in the third line. Let's take a look at another example. So now we have a piecewise function called g of x, and we're going to graph it the same way as we did. We're going to take a look at one line at a time. Here we have our first line, and here we have our second line. Let's concentrate on the first line. Here we have our comma. So on the left-hand side of it, it's going to tell us what's the function we want to consider. So we only want to consider the function y equals -6. And the right-hand side of it is going to tell us what are the x values that we want to use, which in this case are those x values which are less than -2. And now let's graph this line. The equation y equals -6, that's a horizontal line at the y value of -6. Let's graph that. We do not want to consider the whole line. We only want to use those x values which are less than -2, which is this section in the graph, which is this section in our line. So let's erase everything else except this section. The last thing to consider is that in our inequality, notice that there's no equal sign underneath the inequality. So that is telling us that at -2, we need to have an open circle. Well, let's do that in our graph. So now let's move on to the second line. Here we're going to consider the equation y equals x plus 1 raised to the fourth. But we're only going to consider those x values which are greater or equal than -2. So now let me erase my work from the first line to show what figure we would have gotten if we would have graphed the equation x plus 1 raised to the fourth in our graphing calculator. But we don't want to place the entire graph in the piecewise function that we're trying to draw on the right-hand side. We only want to consider those x values which are greater than -2, which is this section in yellow. So in our piecewise function, let's only draw this section shown in pink, which is the section of the graph when x is greater or equal than -2. The only thing that we need to check is, do we have an open or a closed circle at -2? Well, notice that underneath the inequality, we have an equal sign. So therefore, at -2, we're going to have a closed circle. So we have successfully graphed the piecewise function of g of x, which is made out of the blue section here at the bottom and the red section here on top. Hello, if you would like to continue learning about mathematics, you can check out the videos on the left.